The wind howled across the Wyoming plains, carrying with it a biting chill that could freeze a man's breath before it left his lips. Snow swirled like ghostly curtains in the dark, blanketing the land and blurring the line between earth and sky. Inside his weathered ranch house, Elias Ward stoked the fire and listened to the lonely groan of the storm. Nights like this were nothing new to him. He'd faced a dozen winters alone since his wife passed, but each one felt colder than the last. He had finished his supper, beans and coffee gone lukewarm, when a faint sound reached his ears. At first he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then it came again, clearer this time, a frantic knocking. Elias frowned, grabbed his coat and opened the heavy wooden door against the wind. There, half collapsed against the porch railing, stood a woman. Her cloak was soaked through, her bonnet rimmed with ice, and her gloved hands clutched a small satchel to her chest as if it were all she owned. Her lips were blue, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. "Ma'am?" Elias's voice came rough from disuse. "You'll freeze out here." She tried to speak but managed only a weak nod before her knees buckled. He caught her just in time, lifting her slight frame into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. Without another thought, he carried her inside and laid her near the fire. It took a good hour before her shivers eased. He wrapped her in a wool blanket and poured her a mug of coffee. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled like the wind outside. "My name is Clara Bennett," she whispered. "I was supposed to meet a man in Clearwater, a mail-order husband. He never came." Elias listened in silence. He'd heard of such arrangements. Lonely men sending for wives through letters, promises written across miles of paper. He'd never imagined what it looked like when one of those promises was broken. "I left the stagecoach 3 miles back," she continued. "The driver said he couldn't wait in the storm. I thought I could walk." She looked down at her boots, the soles nearly torn through. "I was wrong." Elias poured more coffee, his rough hands steady despite the ache in his chest. "You'll stay here tonight," he said simply. "No use trying to travel till the wind dies down." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I don't mean to trouble you. I can pay." He shook his head. "No payment needed. It's a long way to Clearwater, and no woman should be out in weather like this." For a long while, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Elias sat in his old chair pretending to read, though his eyes never moved from the same line. The woman's presence filled the room in a way he hadn't felt in years. Soft, human, fragile. She reminded him of the warmth he thought he'd buried with his past. When he finally looked up again, Clara had fallen asleep on the rug, her face turned toward the firelight. She looked young, but there was weariness there too, like she'd carried her whole life's sorrow in that small satchel. Elias leaned back, staring into the flames. He told himself it was just for one night. She'd move on come morning, and he'd return to the quiet he knew so well. But as the storm howled outside, something inside him stirred, something he thought had died long ago. For the first time in years, the lonely rancher wasn't waiting for morning. He was watching over the stranger who'd come out of the storm, unaware that she would soon change everything he thought he knew about home, love, and second chances. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the world wrapped in a blinding white silence. The snow lay thick across the prairie, glittering beneath the pale light that crept through Elias Ward's cabin window. Inside, the fire had burned low, sending lazy curls of smoke up the chimney. The scent of strong coffee and frying bacon filled the air, a small comfort against the cold that still clung to the world outside. Clara Bennett stirred on the rug where she'd slept. Her fingers twitched beneath the wool blanket as she blinked into the soft morning light. For a brief, disoriented moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The night before returned in fragments. The storm, the fall, the stranger's arms lifting her out of the snow. She sat up quickly, heart pounding, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Elias turned from the stove, his broad frame outlined by the firelight. "Mornin'," he said quietly, voice still gravelly with sleep. "You were near frozen when I found you. Figured some warm food might help." Clara hesitated, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to kindness without a price. "You've already done more than I could ask," she said softly. "I'll be on my way once the road clears." Elias nodded, though his jaw tightened. "Suit yourself. But that snow's knee-deep in places. You'd best wait a spell, let the sun do its work." He slid a plate toward her, bacon, beans, and a slice of cornbread. It wasn't much, but the smell alone made her realize how hungry she was. She ate slowly, her hands trembling around the tin fork. Elias didn't speak much, just poured himself another cup of coffee and sat at the small wooden table, watching the world outside the window. He was a man of few words, that much was clear, but there was something steady in his silence. Not cold or distant, just careful. When Clara finished, she stood and began to gather her things. Her dress was still damp from the night before, her boots stiff with ice. Elias noticed and frowned. "You'll ruin your feet walking out like that," he said. "I can't stay," she replied. "People already think poorly of women who travel alone. I can't add to it by imposing on a stranger." Elias leaned back in his chair. "Doesn't matter what people think. You've been wronged enough already, I reckon. Ain't no shame in restin' a while." His words carried a quiet authority, but also something gentler, something that made her chest ache. She looked at him properly then, the silver at his temples, the scar at the edge of his jaw, the eyes that held a loneliness deeper than the winter itself. "I don't even know your name," she said after a moment. "Elias Ward," he answered. "This ranch has been mine since my pa passed. Just me now, cattle and quiet for company." Clara gave a small, sad smile. Quiet can be a heavy thing. He met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, neither looked away. The fire crackled softly, filling the space between them with something unspoken, an understanding neither dared name. The day passed in slow rhythm. Clara offered to help wash dishes and sweep the floor despite Elias's protests. She moved with a gentle precision, as if she needed to keep busy to hold herself together. Elias watched from the doorway, hands in his pockets, silently grateful for the sound of another person moving in his home. By dusk, the wind had settled completely. Clara stood by the window, watching the sun sink behind the snow-capped hills. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Elias followed her gaze. "A man forgets that, living out here alone." For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara smiled. It was small, hesitant, but real, and in that quiet, golden moment, something shifted between them. Elias didn't know what to call it, only that when she finally said, "I'll leave in the morning," the word struck deeper than he expected, because for the first time in years, morning meant someone leaving. And Elias Ward wasn't sure he wanted to face that silence again. Night fell heavy and still across the Wyoming plains, the kind of quiet that presses on the chest and fills every corner of a lonely house. Inside the ranch, the fire crackled low, throwing a golden glow over the rough-hewn walls. Clara sat at the small table, mending a torn shirt she'd found drying near the hearth. Across from her, Elias carved a small piece of wood, a habit born of long winters spent alone. The rhythm of knife against grain and the whisper of thread through fabric made the silence almost peaceful. Almost. Clara had been at the ranch 3 days now. Each morning she promised she'd leave. Each evening the weather, or Elias's quiet insistence, found a way to keep her there. The storm had cleared, but the roads were still thick with ice, and truthfully, she no longer knew where she'd go. Clearwater held only bitter memories now. The man who'd promised her a home had taken her savings and vanished, leaving her with shame and a name whispered behind her back. Out here with Elias there was at least warmth and a strange unspoken safety. Elias broke the silence first. "You do good work," he said, nodding toward the mended shirt. "Thank you," Clara replied softly. "It's easy to fix a shirt, people—" "Not so much." Elias looked up at that. The firelight caught the lines in his face, the shadows under his eyes. "You talk like someone who's tried," he said. She smiled faintly, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I tried to make myself fit a life that wasn't mine. A woman with no name, no kin, and no dowry doesn't get many chances. When a letter came offering marriage and a home, I thought it was a blessing. I packed everything I owned in one satchel and came west." Her voice trembled. "I didn't know I was walking into a lie." Elias set down his carving knife. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stood, poured 2 mugs of coffee, and handed one to her. "You're not the first to trust the wrong soul," he said quietly. "And you won't be the last." Clara met his gaze. "You too?" He nodded slowly, eyes distant. "My wife Lily. She passed near 6 years back. Fever took her fast. After that, the house went quiet. I told myself I didn't mind the silence, but I reckon a man can get used to his own ghosts." The confession hung in the air, soft as smoke. Clara watched him, her heart aching for the sorrow in his voice. "You loved her," she said. More than I ever said while she was breathing, Elias admitted. That's the thing about loneliness, it don't come all at once. It creeps in slow, until you wake up one day and realize you've stopped talking, stopped hoping anyone's listening. Clara looked down into her coffee. Maybe that's why I came west. I thought if I could start over, I could find someone who'd listen, someone who'd see me. Elias studied her for a moment. Then softly he said, I see you. The words caught her off guard. No man had ever said them like that, without pity, without want, just truth. The firelight flickered between them, warm and alive, and Clara felt something stir in her chest, a fragile spark of trust. She looked up, meeting his steady gaze. And I see you, Mr. Ward. Elias, he corrected gently. Her lips curved into a small, grateful smile. Elias, then. Outside the wind whispered against the eaves. Inside something quieter bloomed, an understanding. Unspoken yet strong, forged in the hush of shared pain and gentle kindness. When Clara finally rose to bank the fire for the night, Elias reached out and took the mended shirt from her hands. Their fingers brushed, just a fleeting touch, but it was enough to make them both pause. In that small moment, two lonely souls realized they were no longer entirely alone. By morning, the storm had melted into silence. The snow outside the ranch shimmered beneath a pale sun, the air sharp and clear after days of confinement. Clara stood by the window, her hands clasped in front of her apron, watching the long shadows stretch across the frozen ground. For the first time since she'd arrived, the world looked open again, and yet her heart felt heavier than it had that first night she'd stumbled to Elias Ward's door. Behind her, Elias moved quietly through his morning routine, feeding the horses, fetching water, mending a broken latch on the barn door. He'd offered her breakfast, but she hadn't eaten much. There was something final about this morning, something she didn't know how to name. When he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, she turned to him. The roads are clearer now, she said. I should go before the next storm hits. Elias didn't answer right away. He set down his gloves, looking at her with that steady, unreadable gaze she'd come to know. You sure that's what you want? She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the worn satchel that held her few belongings. I can't stay here forever. Folks talk and I don't want to be trouble for you. He leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms. You wouldn't be. This ranch could use another set of hands. You've done more good here than you know. Clara smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it. You've been kind, Elias. Kinder than anyone has been in a long time. But kindness isn't the same as belonging. He said nothing, just nodded once as if he understood too well. Then, after a pause, he crossed to the small drawer by the hearth and pulled something out. A folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased at the edges. I reckon this belongs to you, he said, holding it out. Clara stared at it. It was the letter, the one she'd been clutching when he found her half-frozen that night. The letter that had brought her west. She reached out slowly, fingertips brushing the edge. It was torn, she murmured. I mended it best I could, Elias said. Didn't seem right to leave it broken. The words caught in her throat. She unfolded the letter, smoothing it gently. The ink was smudged, but the words were still there, sweet promises from a man who'd never meant them. For the first time, though, she didn't feel anger or shame. She felt free. Thank you, she whispered. Elias watched her quietly. What'll you do now? She let the letter fall into the fire. The edges curled, the paper turning to ash. Start again, I suppose, she said softly. Find honest work. Maybe earn a place that's truly mine. The flicker of flames reflected in her eyes, and something in Elias's chest tightened. He wanted to ask her to stay, to say the ranch hadn't felt alive until she'd come, but he didn't. She deserved to make her own choice without obligation or guilt. Still, when she turned to gather her things, his voice came low and rough. Clara, for what it's worth, this place will always have a door open to you. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw more than the quiet, solitary rancher she'd met that stormy night. She saw a man who'd lost everything and yet still found the strength to offer shelter, warmth and decency to a stranger. Clara smiled through the sting in her eyes. And if I ever need a home again, she said softly, I'll remember where to find one. Elias nodded, unable to speak. As she stepped out into the snow, the cold wind caught her hair, and for a moment he thought of calling her back. But he didn't. Instead, he stood in the doorway watching until her small figure vanished down the white road. The ranch felt emptier than it ever had, but deep down he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something neither of them yet understood. The next 2 days were long and quiet. Elias tried to throw himself into work, fixing fences, feeding cattle, hauling hay from the barn, but the ranch felt hollow again. Every sound echoed now. The creak of the gate, the scrape of his boots on the floor. Even the wind seemed emptier without Clara's soft voice humming in the kitchen. Each night he sat by the fire, staring at the chair she used to occupy, and wondered if she'd found her way to town safely. He told himself she was strong, resourceful, not one to be lost easily. But still, worry crept in like frost along the window pane. By the third afternoon, the silence broke. He was out by the corral, tightening a rope when he saw 2 riders crest the ridge, dark silhouettes against the pale winter sky. Something about the way they moved made his gut tighten. They weren't locals. Their horses were restless, their approach too direct. Elias watched quietly, one hand on his rifle resting against the fence post. The riders stopped a few yards from him. The first, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, tipped his hat, though his grin was anything but friendly. "Afternoon," he drawled. "Fine spread you've got here." Elias nodded once. "Ain't much, but it's mine. What can I do for you?" The second man, younger and meaner looking, spat into the snow. "We're looking for a woman. Came through here a few days back. Pretty thing traveling alone. You seen her?" Elias's muscles tensed. He didn't answer right away, and that hesitation was enough to make the scarred man smile wider. "She had something of ours," the man said. "A satchel. Brown leather tied with red cord. You wouldn't happen to have come across her, would you?" Elias's eyes narrowed. "Even if I had, that don't make her yours." The younger one stepped forward, resting a hand on his pistol. "We ain't looking for trouble, old man. Just what's owed." Elias's voice dropped low. "Then you'll want to turn that horse around. Ain't nothing for you here." The older outlaw's smile faded. "That's so?" The air went still. Snow crunched under hooves. Wind sighing faintly through the fences. Elias could feel the weight of the moment, the space between peace and violence. He didn't want to fight, but he'd never let harm come to her. Not after everything she'd endured. When the first man reached for his gun, Elias moved faster. The crack of his rifle shattered the still air. The bullet whistled past the man's hand, splintering the wooden post beside him. "That's your warning," Elias said coldly. "Next one don't miss." The younger man cursed and drew his weapon, but his partner barked, "Enough!" They glared at Elias for a long, tense moment, rage and humiliation burning in their eyes. Then, with a jerk of the reins, they turned their horses and rode off into the open white. Elias stood there for a long time, his breath coming hard. When the echo of hoofbeats finally faded, he lowered his rifle and exhaled slowly. He didn't know what those men wanted exactly, but he knew they'd be back. And worse, they knew Clara's name. He saddled his horse and rode toward town as the sun dipped low, his heart pounding with a single thought. If Clara was still out there, she was in danger. By the time he reached the edge of Clearwater, night had fallen. The streets were quiet, save for the flicker of lamps in the saloon windows. He asked around, but no one had seen her. He turned to leave, then spotted her through the frosted glass of the small boarding house across the street. She was sitting by the window, staring out at the snow. Safe for now, Elias exhaled, relief flooding through him. But when he saw a shadow move across the street, the same scarred man watching the boarding house from the corner, he knew the peace wouldn't last. Trouble had found them both. And this time it wouldn't leave without a fight. Elias rode hard through the darkness, snow crunching beneath his horse's hooves. The shadow he'd seen lurking near the boarding house hadn't waited long. By the time Elias reached the door, Clara's frightened cry pierced the night. Without a thought, he burst inside. 2 men were there, the same outlaws from his ranch. The younger one had Clara by the arm, while the scarred man rifled through her satchel. Her face was pale but defiant, her free hand clutching a fire poker she'd clearly tried to use. Elias didn't hesitate. He leveled his rifle. "Let her go." The men froze, eyes narrowing as they recognized him. "You again," the scarred one growled. "Should have minded your own business." Elias's voice was steady, cold. "She is my business." The younger outlaw reached for his pistol, but before he could draw, Elias fired. The bullet struck the floor inches from his boot, splintering wood and sending him stumbling back. Clara wrenched free, ducking behind Elias as he advanced, rifle steady. "You got two choices," Elias said evenly. "Leave now or leave in pine boxes." The scarred man's eyes burned with fury, but something in Elias's stance, calm, unshakable, made him think twice. He spat on the floor and nodded to his partner. "Come on. Ain't worth dying for." They backed out slowly, muttering curses as they mounted up and rode into the night. When the sound of their horses faded, Elias lowered his rifle, his breath fogging in the chill air. Clara was shaking. You shouldn't have come," she whispered. "I wasn't about to let them find you alone," he said gruffly. "You're safe now." But she wasn't calm. Her eyes filled with tears as she sank into a chair. "They said I stole from him, that I took what wasn't mine. But it was my money, Elias. Every coin I saved, every dollar I sent for that marriage that never was. He took it all, and now his men want to finish the job." Elias crouched beside her, his hand gently resting on her trembling shoulder. "You don't owe them a thing." Not a word, not a cent. Her breath hitched. "You could have been killed." He gave a small, tired smile. "Wouldn't be the first time I stared down a gun. But I'll tell you this. No man puts fear in you again while I'm breathing." That broke something inside her. The tears she'd been holding back spilled over, and before she knew it, she was leaning against him, sobbing quietly into his coat. Elias wrapped his arms around her, feeling the fragility of her frame, the tremor of her breath. For a long while, they stayed like that, two souls bound by the simple, unspoken need for safety. When the tears slowed, Elias guided her to the bed. "You need rest," he said softly. "I'll sit by the door." Just in case, she nodded, too exhausted to argue. Within minutes, sleep claimed her. Elias watched from the chair, the lamplight casting her shadow across the room. She looked peaceful for the first time since that night in the snow. By morning, the outlaws were gone from town. The sheriff had found their tracks leading south, and word spread that they wouldn't be returning. Clara and Elias rode back to the ranch together in silence, the sun breaking over the horizon, the world washed clean after the chaos. In the days that followed, Clara refused to leave his side. She cooked, cleaned, helped mend fences, and when Elias's shoulder began to ache from the gunfire days earlier, she tended his wound with careful hands. Each touch, each glance built something neither dared name. One evening, as the sky burned pink and gold, Elias found her standing by the corral, watching the horses graze. "You've made this place feel alive again," he said quietly. She turned to him, her eyes soft in the fading light. "Maybe it was always alive," she said. "It just needed someone to notice." Their gazes met and held, steady, uncertain, but warm. For a heartbeat, the air between them stilled, and in that silence, both knew something had changed. Neither spoke it aloud. They didn't need to. The warmth was enough. For the first time in years, Elias Ward's heart beat not just to survive, but to live. Spring came slow to the Wyoming plains. The snow melted in silver rivers that wound through the fields, and green began to push its way through the thaw. Life returned to the land, and to Elias Ward's ranch. Clara moved through the small house like sunlight after a long winter. The kitchen smelled of bread again, the curtains fluttered with the breeze, and laughter, soft, hesitant laughter, had begun to echo in the quiet spaces where silence once ruled. Elias told himself she was only staying until she was ready to move on. But every day she lingered made it harder to imagine this place without her. He found excuses to stay close, mending fences that didn't need fixing, teaching her how to saddle a horse, showing her the creek where the wildflowers grew. She, in turn, found reasons to stay just a little longer. Another batch of jam to finish, a colt that needed gentling, a promise to help with spring planting. Each day they built something wordless between them, something that felt a lot like home. But all things come to a reckoning, and theirs came on a warm April morning. Clara stood by the wagon, her satchel once again packed. She looked down at her hands, the fingers that had found purpose here, and swallowed hard. "It's time I went," she said quietly. Elias froze where he stood, halfway through hitching the horse. "You sure about that?" She nodded, though her eyes said otherwise. "I can't keep leaning on your kindness. You've given me more than I deserve, Elias." He stepped closer, dust and sunlight clinging to his broad shoulders. "You don't owe me a thing, Clara. You've done more good here than you know. This place, it's not the same without you." Her breath caught at the softness in his tone. "You'll manage," she whispered. "You always have. He looked at her for a long moment, then sighed and finished tightening the harness. But when he turned, something in him broke loose. The wall he'd built around his heart since the day he buried his wife. "I thought I was done with feeling," he said quietly. "I thought what I lost was all I'd ever have. But you," his voice faltered, rough with emotion, "you came out of the snow that night and turned my world right side up again." Clara's eyes shimmered with tears. "Elias." He stepped closer, his hat in his hands. "I told myself I was just offering a stranger a place to rest. But every day you stayed, I found myself hoping you wouldn't go. You don't have to give me an answer, but I need you to know this house, this land, me, they're yours if you want them." For a moment, neither moved. The wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying with it the scent of spring rain. Clara looked at him, this quiet, steadfast man who had given her shelter without question, who had stood between her and danger, who had asked for nothing but her peace, and her heart ached with the weight of it. "I don't know if I deserve something so good," she whispered. Elias reached out, brushing a tear from her cheek with the gentlest touch. "Maybe neither of us do. But maybe that's how grace works. It finds the ones who stopped looking for it." Her lips trembled, but she smiled. "You talk like a preacher." He chuckled softly, eyes warm. "Just a man telling the truth." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. Then Clara took a slow step forward, her hand finding his. "Elias," she said, her voice shaking but sure. "If I stay, it won't be out of gratitude. It'll be because I want to." His fingers closed around hers, rough and steady. "Then that's all I'll ever ask." The words hung between them, simple, honest forever, and for the first time, neither feared the morning. The next morning dawned soft and golden, the kind of morning that felt like a promise. A thin mist rose over the fields, and the air was rich with the scent of wet earth and lilacs. Clara stepped out onto the porch, a shawl wrapped loosely around her shoulders, and breathed it all in. The sound of distant cattle, the faint creak of the windmill, the steady rhythm of life returning. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was standing at the edge of something uncertain. She was in it, rooted, belonging. Elias came out behind her, coffee mug in hand. His hair was still damp from washing, his shirt open at the collar, and his quiet smile met hers before a word was spoken. It was a look that said you stayed, and it made her chest ache in the best way. "Sleep well?" he asked. Clara nodded. "Like I hadn't in years." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sunrise spill across the land. The ranch, still rough around the edges, seemed somehow fuller now, alive with the small signs of care she'd brought. Curtains she'd sewn fluttered in the window. Flowers she'd planted bloomed near the steps. Even the barn cat, once wild, now dozed lazily on the fence post. It wasn't grand, but it was home. Elias took a sip of his coffee, then set the mug down and turned toward her. "You know," he said slowly, "I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all just a dream. A woman appearing out of a snowstorm, fixing everything I didn't even realize was broken." She smiled, eyes glinting with a mixture of shyness and strength. "Maybe it wasn't me who fixed it. Maybe it was just time." "Maybe," he agreed, "but I reckon time wouldn't have meant much without you in it." Clara looked down, her fingers tracing the worn wood of the railing. "When I left Missouri, I thought I was chasing a life that might never exist, a husband, a home, a place to belong. But the man I was meant to marry didn't want me. I thought it meant I wasn't worth wanting." She glanced up, her voice softening. "Then you opened your door that night. You didn't ask for my story or my past. You just saw someone who needed a bit of kindness." Elias's throat tightened. "You weren't the only one who needed it." He reached into his pocket, pulling out something small, a simple silver ring, worn smooth with age. "Belonged to my mother," he said quietly. "Been sitting in a drawer since she passed. Never figured I'd have reason to take it out again." Clara's breath caught. He stepped closer, his eyes steady and unhurried. "I ain't asking for an answer right this second, but I'd be honored if you'd wear it a while. Just to remind yourself that this place, this life, it's yours if you want it." Clara looked at him, tears blurring her vision. Slowly, she held out her hand. Elias slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for her all along. She smiled through the tears, whispering, "I think I already chose, Elias. I stayed." He smiled then, quiet and deep, the kind of smile that came from the heart. The wind rustled through the open fields, carrying with it the scent of lilacs and promise. Somewhere a rooster crowed, and the day began in earnest. Clara leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her, both of them facing the horizon where the light grew stronger by the minute. No vows were spoken that day, no papers signed. But something truer was made, a life bound not by duty, but by choice. And as the sun rose over the Wyoming sky, Elias Ward and Clara Bennett, once strangers bound by a storm, stood together, no longer running from the past, but building the future, one quiet, beautiful morning at a time.